Well, hey everybody, I'm Sam. I am a student of the Bible. I'm a pastor and a writer, and my training involves biblical studies, theology, and biblical languages. So here's a question from Genesis 6 and 7. How do we reconcile God's instructions to Noah from Genesis 6 with God's instructions to Noah in Genesis 7? Because at first glance, you're looking at it, you're going, did God repeat himself? Like, what's going on here? This seems like um, either these are like, an author going, I'm just kidding, kind of a thing, or there's something something we're missing in the story, or these are two different accounts kind of put together. What's going on here? That's the question that we inevitably run into at the end of Genesis 6 and 7. And there's a couple different answers for that. But before we get there, I want to talk to you about something called the Diatessaron. What's the Diatessaron, you may be asking? Well, here's the deal. Not many people probably know what the Diatessaron is. In fact, not many evangelical Christians probably know what the Diatessaron is. The Diatessaron was an attempt to try to take the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and to try to harmonize them together into one gospel. And it's probably the most prominent of these attempts. So there are many attempts to do that in the early church, but during the years between like 160 and 175, a guy named Tatian, who was, I think he was a Syrian, he tried to take part of the Syriac church. He tried to take all four of these Gospels and put them together and impose a unifying, harmonizing framework on them to make them one gospel story. And it was in circulation for a little while in the Syriac church, and then eventually just kind of they did away with it. And there were other people who tried to do this as well. And the church ended up rejecting this. They ended up saying, no, we will not put all four of these gospels together into one mega gospel and imply some kind of harmonizing framework over them. And the reason that they didn't do that was for fear of losing out on the individualness of each one of these Gospels. Even though there are stories within these Gospels that become very difficult to harmonize sometimes, and some of them have details that are very different. For example, Matthew has in the triumphal entry has Jesus riding on two donkeys, or the allusion to that, and the other stories don't. And so it's like, okay, these little details here and there, they don't quite match up all the time. Is that okay? And in a harmonizing framework, we have to say, no, that's not okay. And so they said, no, we're not going to do that because we don't want to lose any of the unique stories that are individualized in these four different Gospels. I mean, can you just imagine if we would have, if this would have gone that route, if the church would have said, you know what, let's make one mega gospel, and we're going to take all the places where they all harmonize together, and we'll keep that in the story, and then we're just going to ditch everything that doesn't harmonize. And John, good luck, because of the four Gospels, John is the one that's the outlier. John is the kind of the weird one. It doesn't really line up too well chronologically. There's a lot of stuff going on in John. It's very spiritually oriented, versus the other ones trying to be historically oriented. But I mean, can you just imagine the stories we would have lost, the rich theology that we would lose by doing that? And that was one of the fears, was like, we can't do this because that would mean we would lose a lot of this stuff, even though sometimes these stories don't line up perfectly in their details. And so the church made a decision, no, we will not do that. We are going to put these four Gospels side by side together, wrapped in a canon together. And that's going to be how we're going to do this. And they're going to sit sometimes in tension with each other, but that's okay. And we are going to view each four of these as equally inspired. So that is that's very, very fascinating, very interesting as we think about the Gospels. What does that have to do with Genesis 6 and 7? Well, here's the deal. Genesis 6 and 7, these two different accounts of what God gave instructions to Noah about what to do about the animals coming onto the ark, seem like if we're going to have one author here, we're going to have to do some things to help us understand what's going on here. But if it's multiple authors, then maybe this is just how things go. Maybe it's okay to sit them side by side. So here there are two different views of what's going on here in Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 7. And I want to fairly represent each one of these views, okay? The first view is that Moses is the author of the Torah. Moses is the author of Genesis, and he is writing, and there is one voice through it. And as he's writing, he writes Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you get to Genesis chapter 6. I'm going to read it in Genesis chapter 7. And this is still one author writing these accounts. And what we have to do then with these two is we have to then apply what is called an apologetic to it to make it make sense. All an apologetics is this. Apologetic is providing a defense for what is there. Okay, so it's an answer that defends what is there. That's an apologetic, okay? And so we need to have an apologetic framework to help this make sense, because I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to show you what the apologetic framework is. So that's the first way, okay? That is one single author. There's something going on here, and we need to have an apologetic framework to help us make sense of it. So let me read the text for you, just so you can see what's going on here, okay? Verse 17, God says to Noah, I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, 2 of every kind of animal, of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. And so then it says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Chapter 7 starts out this way. The Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. And also 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I'll send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Okay, so this is not the only time in this story that we're going to have some details that are a little different. But as you can see, in the end of chapter 6, it's God tells him, take one pair of every kind of animal, male and female, and they're all going to go into the ark. In Genesis chapter 7, though, it's like, okay, so take 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, and then put them on the ark. And so the question ultimately arises from someone who's reading this. It's like, well, what's going on here? Why does it seem like just within these 2 things, it's so different? Well, if we have one author here, the apologetic is this, and the way to explain that is this. It's that God was telling Noah to do this because the clean animals were going to be for sacrificial purposes later on. And God, you cannot sacrifice unclean animals to God. And so he needs clean animals to populate more clean animals. And so you might be asking, well, where do you get that? You get that from reading on in the story to Genesis chapter 8. When Noah eventually comes off the ark, he sets up an altar and offers some of the clean animals to God as a sacrifice to him. And so it does make sense in the story. But then the question that arises, and we have to ask is, well, then why in Genesis chapter 6 did God say take 1 pair of every kind of animal and put them on the ark? Why wouldn't he just say in 7, this is what you're supposed to do? And so the apologetic framework that we have to impose on it is, well, in Genesis chapter 6, the author is being more generic. In Genesis chapter 7, they're being more specific. And it's the very same apologetic that we have to apply to Genesis, the creation accounts from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, to reconcile those if we have a single author. That, Genesis 1, the creation account is more generic, Genesis 2 more specific. Genesis 6 would be more generic, Genesis 7 more specific. And so that's the apologetic framework that we have to read into the text to kind of say, well, this is what the author was doing literarily. So that's one side, okay? And then that can work. It's possible that that's what's going on here, and it's plausible. And that's kind of the framework I grew up with. There is another side that we can look at that's it's a little different. And that side is that these are accounts from different authors. These are different people with different perspectives writing about this story, and these things are just sitting side by side with each other. And there's different clues here and there, like, for example, Elohim is who is in chapter 6, and Yahweh is in chapter 7. And so the different, we've talked about this before, but, the different names of God is kind of maybe these two different authors writing in two different perspectives, using God's name two different ways. And that's how we can kind of see that. The difference in how they're approaching the story could be very different. But here's the thing, and this is why I wanted to go back, because if it's true that these are multiple authors and the details are different from each other, well, why is that okay? Why didn't they edit that out? And they didn't do that. If this is the way it is, and this is the truth behind it, the reason that they wouldn't do that is because they were okay with these two things sitting side by side in tension with each other, because they didn't want to lose either part of this story. That they wanted to have the truths of both parts of these stories, and they viewed both of them as equally inspired. And so, even if they kind of don't fully agree with each other, that we cannot lose what's going on in this part of the story, and we cannot lose what's going on in this part of the story, so let's keep them together in that. And so here's why I brought up the Diatessaron, and why I brought up the church and how they viewed the Gospels, because they viewed the Gospels in the same way. It's almost as if this is a framework, the way the Bible kind of has been working all this time. It's that that when the church, or even the Jewish people, when they canonize their scripture, they do not want to lose any part of it to any of it. Like, they don't want, there's these stories, and the theology in them are too rich to just let them go away, even if there's some inconsistencies that are sometimes can be hard to harmonize. And they all are considered equally inspired. And so that for us kind of makes us feel kind of funny, because we're like, well, how can they all be equally inspired, and yet they differ so much? And I think the reason that they would be able to say that, the early church would have, and especially the Jewish people, is that the unifying framework of inspiration is not harmonization. There's a different unifying framework that they're working with, and it's not harmonization. There's something else going on here, and the unifying framework of inspiration is of a theological nature. There's something else bigger, better, stronger going on here than just harmonizing these stories to make them fit together perfectly. And because they don't want to lose each author's perspective. And so and I'm not saying that's what it is, okay? Because it could very well be one author, and it could be a generalization and a descriptive. But if it is multiple different perspectives, multiple different authors, multiple different sources, then we have to also think, well, these different authors are equally, different sources equally inspired by God, and there's something about them that unifies them together that isn't harmonization. And so there's something deeper, richer, better than that holds them together and wants to hold them together, and that we can see through them. And so Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 7 are what we have, and we read them that way. And as we read them, we need to be asking better questions than, why do these stories don't line? Why does the end of 6 not line up perfectly with all the details of 7? Or what we need to ask is, okay, so what's God doing here? What's going on here? And what's the bigger theological points? Because as I've pointed out before, in the ancient Near East, those were the unifying questions they were asking. Who is God? Who are we? What's going on in this story that helps us understand who God is, and helps us understand what's going on in their world? And as we do that, the theological things become front and center, and the other things become tensions to manage in the story. All right. Well, hopefully that is helpful. I know for me, as I read these, sometimes I have those questions, and I go, what is this? And, you can't, either one or the other. I'm not sure which one it would be. I'm not going to say I know, because I don't think any of us can really know that for sure. But there are ways to harmonize these, and harmonize is not the right word. There are ways to reconcile these that aren't just like, well, let's harmonize them all together and make it all fit and work. And there's an equal inspiration of the text that I think we need to pay attention to, and equal inspiration of authors of the text. And so that's important. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. If you like the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.